1, 2, 3, 4.
Hi, and welcome to the Vininspo podcast with me, Ed Merrison. This is where wine is a travel experience. Join us as we pick up bits and pieces, make new friends, and create memories that make our future interactions with wine, people, and places all the more meaningful and fun. My guest on this week's podcast is Patrick Walsh, founder of the Australian wholesale distributor and importer CellarHand. Founded in Melbourne in 1999, CellarHand is known as a specialist in Germany and Austria, but also brings in wines from France, Italy and Hungary, and boasts several leading lights from Australia and New Zealand. I had the pleasure of working there for almost a decade. We also recorded a separate segment on German wines. Please keep an eye out for that bonus content on my Substack. Our conversation here touched upon the first stirrings of a sommelier scene, selecting wines for explosive footballers, the oh-so-near pop star career, four-wheel drive escapism in the Aussie outback, pets with Grand Cru palates, the drama of Grüne Veltliner, and dodgy roads and delicious drops in Corsica. I started by asking Patrick about where his tastes were formed.
I grew up on a dairy farm in County Limerick in Ireland by virtue of being born in Australia, but moving there when I was 5 years old, and grew up in a house that was devoid of wine. Wine was not a thing, ever. I remember, ironically enough, the first bottles of wine that I ever laid eyes on were Black Tower and Blue Nun, Liebfraumilch from Rheinhessen, because guests of my parents had brought them, and I didn't really know what they were because my dad drank a bit of Guinness and some whiskey. My mum doesn't drink at all, and wine wasn't a thing. So it's quite ironic that, all those years later, I find myself immersed in it entirely. Born in New South Wales, moved to Ireland at 5, had my formative years of between the ages of 5 and 15 there, and then came back to Australia. And I say formative years because music, culture, Liverpool Football Club, everything that's close to me, important to me outside of wine is from there, and it stays with you forever.
We'll absolutely get onto those interests at some point. First of all, though, tell me about your first experiences of Australia.
Well, to be politically incorrect, when I came to Salesian College in Chadstone in 1983 or 84, the Skips called me a wog and the wogs called me a skip. So I sort of fitted in this no man's land. I was a trench coat wearing, dyed hair, blonde, sometimes with eye makeup. What I would classify as a futurist. We didn't like to call ourselves new romantics because we were cooler than those guys. But it was born out of that musical culture. And I found myself dropped into a absolutely alien world. And it was quite, I think, confronting. And I think it took me many years to realize how immersive that was and how really quite weird it was. But gradually found my own way, found my own people, as it were, and finished up loving being in Australia and very much consider myself Australian these days. I have done for years. I'm not one of these pining people who've grown up in Ireland and then left and always consider Ireland home. A lot of people that I know are like that. I'm not like that. I'm Aussie. My kids are Australian. My wife's Australian and proud to be here.
And was music a big part of fitting in Australia?
Yeah. Ironically enough, going out to clubs in the mid 80s and met people and did bits of stuff on radio and met some guys in bands and found that there was a whole culture out there of people who did understand where I was at. And I fitted in quite well and guested on PBS FM a few times with a friend who had a show there, and we played Depeche Mode and Gary Newman, and it was all good. And that was part of the assimilation, if you like, and then went off to uni eventually to do a social science degree. But really that was just because my parents wanted me to go to uni. I just wanted to be a pop star by that stage and was playing music all the time and got jobs in kitchens to buy better gear and musical gear. And then when I finally gave up on, I haven't entirely given up on it, but when I sort of paused my musical career, restaurants was the next thing. And I had worked my way up in kitchens and onto the floor. And eventually I was what was known as a sommelier before that was a thing.
We should say on the music front, you are recording this in a proper studio with music around you. And the music really did go quite a long way.
It did. One of our great ironies of our life was in 1992, I'm going to say maybe 91, 92, somewhere around there, Virgin Records in Australia were very keen on us. And We went to Sydney to meet the managing director at his house in Double Bay. He said that they were considering us as the logical progression from Pseudo-Echo Kids in the Kitchen, Chocolate Starfish, etc., etc. They wanted us to do 5 albums. Contracts were being drawn up. It was very exciting. And unfortunately, very unfortunately, about 10 days later, we received a fax to say that even though they were still keen, they'd been sold to EMI America and all new signings were off for 18 months. And we were like, 18 months, that's the rest of our lives. You guys can go and get stuff. So we never got back there. We never got that close again, but that was pretty close.
That is tantalizing. And so you say the music led you sort of to kitchens as a side gig, and that led onto the restaurant floor, I'm guessing, and wine came then.
Yeah, well, Virginia, because Gin and I have been married 33 years as of last week and been together for 40 years. It's incredible when you think about it. But she'd encouraged me to, get a better job than I had. I was working at a nursing home as a kitchen hand, and half the time wouldn't show up because I'd be too hungover. My first interview was at the Grand Hyatt, which is called the Hyatt on Collins, then in must have been 1987 or 88 when that first opened. And that was the last job interview I ever had. It was really weird. So I had a job interview there to work as a waiter, and then a year or two later, the F&B director, Kevin Donovan, who passed away recently, last year, tapped me on the shoulder and said he's moving to his own restaurant in South Yarra. Would I like to come? And a few other guys as well. And it went on from there, and you sort of got a tap on the shoulder. Walter Burke would ring up and say, I'm opening a wine bar, etc., and just gradually drifted more and more into good restaurants and more into the wine side of restaurants, and had some really good grounding. And the landscape was so different. I was laughing this week. The fabulous new Gioconda wines are being released this week. And Rick Kinsbrunner had come to Brown's to see, this was in 1989, to see Cyril and I, my French, great colleague, French mate to this day. And we said, where are you from again? Beechworth, is it? Yeah, the Chardonnay is actually quite good. We'll put this on the wine list. How much is it going to be? And I've still got a copy of that wine list, and it's $36 on the list. And we sold loads of it. And I used to buy a case every year. It was great fun. But it goes to show how far things have gone and how times have changed.
Times have absolutely changed. And I'd love it if you put us in the picture a little bit of what being a sommelier, which the term wouldn't have probably been used at the time, but that's what you became one of the first of, I guess, in Melbourne. What was the actual wine scene like in terms of buying? Where was the knowledge coming from? Who were the mentors? How ahead of your time were you?
Well, I think there was a group of us who tried to get ahead of the curve. People like Grant Van Every. There was a guy called Frank Heaney who was managing restaurants with Estes and Jacques Raymond and all those sorts of places. Curtis Marsh, who was an importer in those days and a distributor. A bunch of us got around a table at Andrew Blake's restaurant. This must have been about 1992, 93. And we said, well, look, we're leading our restaurants here by virtue of the fact that we're doing the staff rosters, we're choosing the wines, but we're not being treated seriously as career professionals because that's not a thing. And in other countries, they have sommeliers associations. Why don't we try and get one off the ground here? Which we did. And Grant was the president for a few years. Then I was the president for a few years, and then Ben Edwards took the mantle on, and it sort of really grew from there. But it was a different sort of thing. It wasn't so much about what it is now, very, very driven by, where that vineyard is, where that crew is, or very, very specific knowledge. This was more about getting the service side of it appreciated and getting the job appreciated as being a real thing. So it was a scenario where gradually we signed more and more people up, and we used to do field trips out to the Yarra Valley or up to Heathcote, and just got more and more people interested in and believing that, choosing wine for a restaurant could be as important as coming up with a good menu.
I'm interested in a couple of things there. The very beginning of that fire burning in that scene, I'm assuming was really quite exciting for producers. And also that you were really the forerunner, I guess, to the potential career of lots of other people too. So that excitement was really nascent, but growing in all areas.
Oh, absolutely. And I tip my hat off mostly to Walter Burke, who passed away a long time ago now. Walter was an ex-principal dancer of the Australian Ballet and loved food and wine. And when he and his wife, Maria, retired from ballet dancing, they had a crack at running a restaurant, which is called Maria and Walter's. And it was in Rathdown Street in Carlton. And it was epically great in terms of a simple degustation menu. It was BYO back in the day. They had a wine list as well. And then he puckered up the courage to open a wine bar at Southgate when that first was built. And he had the brains to go at the far end of the building, up close to where the theatres were, whereas everyone else thought the great tenancies were down on the river. Walter realised that your ready-made market was going to be feeding in from the theatres, which it did. It proved so right. And it was nothing for us to do, 500-600 covers on a weekend night. And it became a real hub for wine because he had the gumption to do great wines by the glass. I'm talking Rousseau, Gevrey, Chambertin, or Chateau Gazan, Pomerol, or Blanc-Gagnard, Chassagne-Montrachet by the glass at $30 back in those days. I came up with the idea of a little sommelier selection where you might do 3 or 4 different things. Yeah, it really got people thinking and talking, and many others followed. Don Fitzpatrick in St Kilda was around at that time. He was a visionary as well. There were others, but it's almost like it started then. And it was very different because the licensing laws in Sydney, for example, were very different. There weren't really the wine bars. So we were able to have a really good run at it. And so many wines that we think about as being commonplace in Australia today, we were the first to run with. Clonic Killer was unheard of. And the first couple of vintages were Shiraz Pinot blends, and we had them by the glass, and Rockfords and Chris Ringland's Three Rivers, and etc. Turkey Flat Rosé. Before Turkey Flat Rosé, it was Turkey Flat Grenache Noir, they called it, the black Grenache, and we had that. And it was, all those sorts of things. And in those days, Walter said we could have German Riesling and we could have grower champagne, and a lot of what you see is commonplace now, but it was really weird and wonderful then. Handwritten menus, handwritten wine lists. And it was great grounding and really exciting times because we were plunged into this world which seemingly didn't exist before that.
And it's interesting the reference to the theatre, because I can see from the musical background, from the people teaming in from the theatres and being really excited about the interactions, but also the sales, it would have been pretty buzzy.
Oh, it was great fun. Tom Jones came to the wine bar one night after a show, and Walter fancied himself as a good drinker, and Tom Jones literally obliterated Walter drinking whiskey till 4 a.m. And it took him 3 days to recover, I think. Tom Jones, meanwhile, went and did a show the next night, no problem. It was all that sort of stuff. There was another night, I remember, Michael McMahon, who had that Catalina Rose Bay in Sydney restaurant, Len Evans and Walter had dinner one night, and the idea of the dinner was to drink as much Romani Conti as they could. And we had 4 vintages of La Tâche that night, and I was invited to sit and drink the wines with them. I mean, this would be a $250,000 experience today, right? This was 1978, 1985, 1990, and maybe one other vintage. We drank 4 bottles between 4 people of DRC, and it wasn't because they were showing off. They just wanted to drink these bottles. It was great.
And so from the restaurant to the beginnings of an importing business, how did that transition work?
After Walters, I'd gone back to Chinois for a while and then finished up at Langton's restaurant in Flinders Lane with Stuart Langton and Andrew Caillard and Philippe Michel and their partners. And those guys had Shadowfax Winery, and they wanted to appoint a distributor for Shadowfax. And they asked me for my opinion on a few distributors at the time, and I was less than enthusiastic about a couple because I'd seen them from the other side. And I'd been to Europe actually the year before on a scholarship, Frankland Estate Winery that we sell and hold close to our hearts to this day. They ran a Riesling scholarship, and I always tell the story that seemingly nobody else entered because I won the thing, and I went to visit Europe and met all these great producers and came back to Australia, and the idea started to germinate. I was like, well, maybe I could import some of those wines. What's involved in being an importer? And then coinciding with that, almost that decision flow, Shadowfax said needed a distributor, and Andrew Caillard said to me, well, do you want to do it? We have to quit the restaurant. And I was like, well, maybe I do. I don't know. Maybe we could. So Virginia and I discussed it, and we said, we'll give it a go for a year or two. And we're still giving it a go. So it went from there, went from that, never quite decided to start a wine company, but it just sort of gradually morphed out of a scholarship trip. And then the kids were starting to go. Aidan was at school by this stage or going to kinder. I was still locking up the restaurant at 4 a.m. and sometimes, and it wasn't healthy. So we just decided to have a crack at it, as I say, and went from there.
And so this was CellarHand, founded in 1999.
Yeah.
Can you remember the first beginnings, the first orders that came in, how it felt to be on the street, running your own thing, dealing with principals overseas, that sort of stuff?
In those days, getting an email, right, was like receiving something in the post. It would come in so slowly on one of those beepy things, and you'd look at it and go, oh, there's an email from Weingut Robert Weil in Rheingau, or there's an email from Ernie Lowson, or it's an email from whoever. And what we'd done some months prior, we'd done like a trial tasting. We did this at a restaurant called Pom in Toorak Road, which is owned by Jeremy Strode and Chris Young. And I got a bunch of samples out from Europe, from Pierre Spa in Alsace and Heyman Lovenstein and Grans Fassian in the Mosel, various people. And we did a tasting, and I invited all my friends I knew in Sommeliers Australia, and I said, look, if I was importing any of these, would you guys buy them? And David Cappadeus, who was a guy who was working at the European, thought I had the wines in stock and gave me an order for like 5 dozen of the Pierre Spa and 2 dozen of this and that. I was like, whoa, this is actually an order. And I had to explain we'd be able to fill it, but it'd be a few months. But yeah, it took it from being, actually, this could be a thing. We could actually go there. And it was really exciting. And we were operating the business from a bedroom in our house in Prospect Hill Road. It'll, what do you call a dot printer, or printing up the portfolios every morning before I'd go out. I was doing it initially on my day off on Mondays from restaurants, and then took the plunge and went into it. But yeah, the early days of the journey are often the most exciting in anything, right? And as producers started to, I guess, talk amongst themselves, we got a very good reputation for paying our bills on time. We've always done that because it's an important thing, and Australia didn't have a best reputation in regard to that. Yeah, we just sort of got a few good brands approach us early on, and then we just waited. We weren't in any hurry. And gradually, word got out, and, away we went. That excitement, I'm still like that. I still feel like a wine rep to this day. If I get an order off a guy who I haven't sold wine to before, I'm very excited. And if it's a mixed case, that's also very good. 2 cases is better, but 1 case, fine, small steps.
What would you say are the things that make someone enjoy that job and also good at that job?
You have to be able to cope with the school of hard knocks is the first thing I would say. Some people who go from a front of house role and think they want to be a wine rep, when you're in a restaurant and you hand someone the wine list, it's almost certain that they want to choose something, they want to buy something. When you're repping, you've got no such guarantee. I remember early days when I'd go and see someone or drop a sample off to someone, and I would know that I had vastly more knowledge than that person, but that person might say, no, that Chardonnay isn't very good. I don't like it at all. And you can't say, well, no, you're wrong. It is great. You have to say, oh, really? Oh, okay. I'll tell you what, I've got another. I'll come back and see you next week, and we'll see if we can find something else. We've always wanted our team to be the rep, the salesperson that a customer most wants to deal with. We want them to contact us and say, what have you guys got that I can pour for $18 that's in a Shirazi space or whatever. It's about that. It's about making yourself a desirable and interesting contact. And sometimes the best thing you can do to a customer is say, actually, no, that wine I don't think will be good for you for these reasons, whereby you're showing a little bit of honesty and a bit of transparency and not just selling at all costs. You can sell something bad in once, but you won't sell it in a second time. So, we've tried to have that integrity about the way we've gone about it.
What about the buying side? What is it about who you've chosen to work with and how you've tried to manage that side of the business?
One of our rules of thumb is, would we want this producer at the kitchen bench at home to have dinner and a sleepover and get to know them? And if the answer is no, like if we think, like we've been in situations where we've looked at some wines sometimes and the wines themselves have been excellent, but you got the feeling from the producer that they weren't going to be respectful of either us or the rest of our portfolio, or for whatever reason, it wouldn't be a good fit. So we've turned down some good, I guess you'd say, commercial opportunities when that opportunity has arisen, because we've wanted things to be right. And it was interesting. I was listening to your podcast with Freddie Blanc from last week, and he used the word emotion about wine. And you want to have the right feeling with the producers that you're working with. And obviously, I'm very good mates with Ernie Lawson or with whoever, and I'm not going to be that close to everyone, but you want the feeling that they respect what you're trying to do, never more so than in recent years when, last couple of years have been pretty hard in the industry overall, and you want people to work with you on that, but not push you for unreasonable results. We want producers who are driven to make the best wines they possibly can, to sell them at fair prices, to add something to what we can offer. It's a very different landscape now to when we started. Now there's hundreds of importers. There's loads of guys importing from Germany and Austria. In the early days, we really had a free pick and all that. I'm very comfortable with the picks that we made. There wouldn't be too many that I would want to transfer out and get other players to come in, because there's some pretty good people there.
And you mentioned a family from Frankland estate who were instrumental in your start in the Riesling world, the Smith-Cullen family. Obviously, running a family business, presumably a lot of those relationships, those connections are about family too.
Yeah, absolutely. And, in the case of Frankland, Lizzie and Hunter are now at the helm, taken over from the parents almost entirely. So we've seen that generational shift. And we can say the same thing about Johannes Hasselbach at Gunderloch, or et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot where we're now working with the second generation. And you can see the enhancements, the improvements that the second generation have made to some of these estates. but they've never sort of thrown the baby out with the bathwater. It's not like they've gone along and said, well, that was all crap. We're going to do it much better now. Maybe apart from Ernie Lowson, who did exactly that from the previous regime. But yeah, that family thing. And, sometimes I guess people snigger at us and say, oh, you're always crapping on about wine family. And, but they are to us, a lot of these people, we've been to most of their houses. They've been to our place. You've seen it in the past when you worked with us all those years. It is like a family of growers. And we've always wanted the growers to complement each other and not feel as though they're competing with each other. So we've tried to, as much as is possible, not to have too many portfolio clashes that don't work.
I guess we're going to go travelling a little bit when we talk about some of the wines and where they come from. Four-wheel driving and camping, another love of your life. I just want to know about where that fits in with the wine thing. Is that just about escape, or does it fit in with the social side of what you do?
No, it's pretty separate. I was actually away on the long weekend just before now with the newly formed Ineos Four-Wheel Drive Club of Victoria. And we had 7 of these cars. There are 100 members already in the club. And we had 7 of these cars in the most extreme four-wheel drive country that Victoria has to offer. What we call triple locked black run tracks, whereby you've got rear diff lock, front diff lock, and center diff lock all engaged. So you're basically like a tractor climbing up these crazy inclines. And what I love about it, one, the escapism, the camaraderie, different mix of people, but the absolute block out of the rest of the world, because you have to be very serious at this. If you can fuck up and things can go badly wrong. So you have to, A, know what you're doing, and B, have the confidence in the vehicle and what your own abilities are. But yeah, it's sheer escapism. When we do the big trips, we go to Simpson Desert or the Outback, and we get very prepared with food and wine. I have Gabrielle glasses in a flight case. I have food that we've cooked at home that Gin's cooked, and it'll be something really lovely, a good curry or whatever, and then frozen into blocks, cryovac, runs in a freezer. At the start of a day, each driver will get something out. So we can literally pull up at camp, rooftop tent, everything folds out. 15 minutes after arriving, we are set up with a gin and tonic in hand and some pork rillettes on the go. That's great fun because people's notion about camping is baked beans on toast and whatever. We've never done that. It's like luxury camping in extreme locations. So it's not glamping by any means. It's just being a bit organized. And yeah, it's pure escapism.
And presumably it's also fueled by and has fueled your love of Australia, because it's an amazing country for that.
Absolutely. And only like relatively recently, it occurred to me that in those early days when we grew up in Dapto in New South Wales, our next door neighbour was the local mine manager. There was a coal mine close by, and he used to get around in a Series 2 Land Rover, an old Land Rover. And I was allowed occasionally to go in the Land Rover with Peter, down the mine, wear a miner's hat, and see what was going on. And I think this love of land rovering, as I call it, got under my skin in those days, and I didn't own a Land Rover for another 30 years after that. But it's one of those things that really gets under your skin, whereby the car I drive now isn't a Land Rover, it's an Ineos, but it's the closest thing you can get to actually what Land Rovers used to be.
And presumably you've put a few souped up add-ons for your wine drinking and dining.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Currently transitioning towards, I can never think what it's called, induction cooking. So we've always used gas cookers, but there's getting the advances in battery technology and all that now, whereby hopefully in the near future we'll be cooking on induction in the bush. So you don't have to carry fuel around. Very, very clean, very, very tidy. Everything's lightweight, chairs, tables, folding pots and pans. It's all about minimal impact. The lighter you could be, the better off, the further you'll go.
I can't promise that we'll take the listeners out bush, but we will go around Australia maybe a bit. What's exciting at the moment in Australian wine?
My gut reaction to that question, first thing that springs to mind is Australian Chardonnay right now, whether it be from the west or from the east or the south. There's a lot of great stuff going on. We've shaken off the cloak of we have to look like Burgundy. So we're making wines that are very, very assured, that take all the best references from the Burgundy examples and wrap it into an Australian portrait. And whether that's Margaret River or Adelaide Hills, Yarra Valley, Geelong, Tasmania, there's just so many great examples where winemaking is in check but present. Vineyard terroir is coming forward. There's just an enormous amount of joy and drinkability. And I'm always craving that concept of joy. To sit down and drink a glass of wine, it should be fun, right? It should be enjoyable. You shouldn't have to work at it to unfurl pleasure. And I think of any of the varieties right now, that's one that really, really springs to mind. You've got to say what's happening with Grenache in McLaren Vale. We work with Steve Pannell, obviously doing fabulous things and more to come, but there's a whole collective there. And when they're made in the right way and served at the right temperature and, those off the sandy soils, that's super exciting. Obviously, Riesling has come a long way. I'm lucky enough to help with the Lynn Evans tutorial over the last couple of years now. So I've had a really good look at the dry Riesling landscape in Australia and the textural stuff. And again, people have gotten over just leaving residual sugar in wines and they're looking unbalanced to some really lovely textural, mineral, fleshy, off-dry examples and dry ones that are maybe not quite as dry as they used to be. So they've got more harmony. That's really good. They're probably the three that, and obviously the other one is Cabernet, because we're still in the scenario where if we write a tasting note on One Turner or Nocturne or whatever from our portfolio, you're writing this note and you read it back and go, well, that sounds delicious. And it is delicious, but sometimes that's that hurdle to get the gatekeepers, the trade, to take those on board is harder than it should be. But that is changing as well. We're starting to arrive with Cabernet, but there's, the Australian wine industry is pretty young, right? So it's, there's so much in its future, but I've never been more excited about it than now.
Fantastic. Well, on that note, we'll leave Australian shores temporarily and head overseas. You mentioned your Tom Jones experience. I'm sure that your experiences in Europe have had maybe not Tom Jones, but plenty of other sort of pinch me moments and quite funny ones too. Are there any in your sort of formative years in the importing business that you just think, I can't believe I was doing that then?
Well, absolutely. And the first one that springs to mind is following a truck in January 2004, pacing out the distance between my hotel and Domaine Leroy in Von Romane, because I wanted to not be late the next day for my appointment. I'd never been to Burgundy before. My first confirmed appointment was with La Lubise. So I wanted to get out there the previous day, make sure that I knew exactly where it was. There were no Google Maps, obviously. Number 15, Rue de la Fontaine in Von Romane. It's burned in my brain. And paced it all out, no problem. Knew where I was going. Got up the next morning, leaving myself plenty of time. Got on the N74, and there's a truck in front of me with the words Convoy Exceptionnel. And I'm thinking, it's a Convoy Exceptionnel. And it was it was a big, like, I don't know, some massive piece of equipment taking both lanes that I could not get past. And, I got away with it. I got there with 5 minutes to spare. But yeah, then I was in this tasting with La Lubise and her offsider and about 8 or 9 other people, tasting the 2003s from bottle all the way up to Chambertin and Muzzini. And when we got to the second last one, the Chambertin, Lalu starts calling for her puppy dog, and she's looking around, and I can't remember what the name of the dog was. I wish I could. Fifi, maybe. Where is the poodle? She's saying. And the dog comes running, and she gets Chambertin, right? Usually 3 bottles for Australia, sometimes 6, but mostly 3. And she pours Chambertin into the dog's bowl, and the dog is. And she turns to me and says, "He loves the fruit in the Chambertin." And you just go, I can't believe this, I cannot believe this. If only I could have videoed it. True story. Anyway, the rest of the people left and they said to me, you stay. I was like, okay, I'll stay. So I was sat down and grilled as to what I would do if they granted me the agency for Domaine Leroy for Australia. And yeah, so they said, okay, well, we'll give you a trial for 12 months. And that was more than 20 years ago. So there we are. That was amazing, But there have been many moments like that have been quite thrilling.
I'd love to know what Lalou would do if she were stuck behind a Convoy Exceptionnel and running late, because I gather she's quite a speedy driver.
She's quite a speedy driver. Yeah, she would have. Yeah, I don't know. She'd find a way around it, I think, just quietly.
Very briefly, what should people know about Burgundy, and how much they shouldn't get hung up on it?
Look, it's one of those areas where it's very producer driven, isn't it? There are some absolutely sublime wines from Burgundy, and there's some absolute rubbish. And for the unwary, it can be a bit of a minefield. Just because it says Premier Cru and Grand Cru on the label is no guarantee of greatness. But the wines, when they're on song, when the producers are at the top of their game, they're as exciting as wines from anywhere. So across white and red, you're looking for purity, freshness, terroir definition, clarity, lightness of touch, I think is what I'm trying to get at, whereby Color isn't so important in red wine. It doesn't need to be a deep color for it to be deeply moving as a red. I think, it's in many respects, it's gotten a bit ahead of itself with pricing and all that sort of stuff. And whether or not our mate Trump will have anything to do with prices coming down remains to be seen if those tariffs kick in. But yeah, it's one of those things where I don't consider myself any deep expert on Burgundy. I've been lucky enough to be working in around the region for 20 odd years. The other thing you can look for now, of course, is that places like Saint-Aubin or Monteley, etc., places that basically were not very famous until more recent years, offering great value, and there's some fantastic wines to be had from some of those places now as well.
I'm going to controversially sidestep Germany, and I'd like to tiptoe over the other side to Austria. You've got some very prestigious names from the Wachau in the portfolio and elsewhere across Austria. First of all, could you just talk a little bit about what's so special about that land, starting on the Danube Valley? Where did you first come across those?
There was a contact we had, a Dutch woman who was working in Germany, who was a bit of a broker for some of those agencies early doors, and introduced us to what's now Domain of Wachau. It was called Freie Weingarten of Wachau in those days, and got a crash course in the Wachau terminology and some of that from her and from those wines, which we looked at very early. And then there was one famous night at one of the Frankland International Riesling tastings in Sydney, where a number of the Wachau Fab Four, as we call it, had come out. So Elizabeth Pichler was there from F.X, Tony Bodenstein was there from Praga, the Knolls were there, Franz Herzberger and Irmgard's Herzberger were there. And I'd only read about the wines, so I hadn't really had much exposure to them, but I knew that, it was a great opportunity. And I went to talk to Elizabeth Pichler, and I said to her who I was and that I was working with Ernie Lewson and Bernhard Breuer in his early days. And I wondered if there would be a possibility of a small allocation for Australia. To which she said, yes, I hear you good things. That will be fine. We can arrange that for you. And Ernie, who was sitting next to me, leant over and said, did you just get like an allocation of FX? And I said, I think so. I think I did. He said, watch. Before the end of the night, you'll have them all. And during the course of the dinner, true enough, Tony Bodenstein came over and said, I understand you're working with FX Pichler, And I'm like, well, as of 20 minutes ago, yes, I am. So we came away from that dinner with pretty much those four producers in the bag for Australia, which is so exciting. The Wachau is a brilliant place to grow grapes, as you no doubt seen it firsthand. The terroir there is so different. The soil is so different to anywhere in Germany. This really sort of primary rock, nice schist granity sort of soils. And in those days, I guess the wines were bigger and bolder than they are now. So the next generation have come along and got a whole degree of refinement and restraint into them that maybe wasn't there in the early days. But they needed to grab the world's attention after what had happened in the mid-'80s with wine scandal. And they certainly did that. And then gradually we started to meet other regions like Willy Brundelmeyer in Kamptal, fantastic producer, fantastic man, great company, now run by Andreas Wieckhoff, who's one of the most compelling wine dudes on the planet. And had met Fritz Miesbauer when he was at Domain of Wachau, but then he was at Stadkrems and Steve Gottweg, and the relationship sort of kicked along from there. And then I was at one of the tastings I was at a Vininspo thing in Bordeaux at one time, and Teresa Breuer had invited me to one of these satellite events at Vininspo, and it was there that I met Roland Vellick from Moritz. And I was like, who is this dude? And he was standing there, as he always, a very imposing, unshaven, cool jacket with these very angry-looking bottles, Lutzmannsberg and Alter Reben and Neck and Markt. And I'm like, what is this stuff? I don't even know what it is. And it turns out, of course, they were the world's great Blaufränkisch wines. And he's been a legendary character in our lives ever since. In fact, one of his people was here just last week for a flying visit and showed us new stuff from their own Hungarian project, where they're redefining Harchevelu and Furmint as a dry wine. And that's exciting because we've been dabbling with a few producers from there, but the Moritz guys have got this actual own vineyard joint venture happening now. So, that's a really exciting part of the world as well. So the Austrian thing, I guess, was very much white wine in the early days. It's now red wine's not quite as important, but very much on the up and up.
We're talking about in the Wachau and the Kamptal, you mentioned incredibly dramatic scenery, and I would say wines that can really match that drama. We talk a lot about tasting a place in wines, and that really is a memorable place. Tell me a little bit more about how you see tasting the Riesling and also Grüner Veltliner, which is probably a grape that lots of people have come across, but certainly wouldn't have had as much experience with as you.
Yeah, I think the thing about Wachau is it's one of the most powerful terroirs in terms of sometimes in a blind tasting, I get tricked up as to whether it's Gruner or Riesling because from some of those producers and vineyards, particularly something like, say, Achleiten vineyard, which is one of those ones which is sort of cantilevered over the Danube, and it's got this real pungency to it. And, in a lineup, I go, oh, this is definitely Achleiten, but then I look like a goose because I go, well, it is Patrick, but it's Riesling, and you said it was Gruner. And I go, there we go. So they're smoky, spicy, textural, expressive. The sort of Federspiel level of that stuff for me is the most useful, certainly for our market. Sometimes the Smaragd wines, the reserve ones are like fantastic, but you sit down to the second glass and it's quite a lot of work, whereas first class or writing a tasting note can be quite compelling. The Federspiel stuff where it's plenty of ripeness but not too much. And then you go Kamptal. I always think the Kamptal stuff is a little bit more loose-knit, a little bit more open, supple, and some of the Kamptal Gruners, like we work with, say, with Brundelmeier, and those wines from vineyards like Kaferberg and Lam, with a couple of years of age, with 5 years of age, they really start to go in the white Burgundy direction. They're less of a Riesling direction and very much the sort of oatmeal, biscuit, white chocolate, coffee rock, savory, really compelling. Have them in a Burgundy glass, don't have them too cold. They're pretty scintillating wines as well. They probably don't get the look in that they ought to. The Wachau stuff gets more focus, I guess, but I'm really excited by those as well.
Absolutely. And so just to clarify, we're talking about those Smaragd wines. Those are the most powerful, ripest grapes for wines that have more body, a little bit more alcohol. So the Federspiel, medium-bodied, mid-weight expression of Riesling or Gruner. It's hard to generalize too much because the land really shows up in these wines. But someone trying something in that category, around a 12.5% alcohol Gruner Veltliner that's dry, what would you expect them to want to get out of that?
A wine with attractive bitterness. I think there's a grapefruity character in there that's a savory bitterness whereby it's not sour to finish, but it's a complex bitterness on the palate. Peppery characters, as in white and black pepper are often, they're mostly more like white pepper, and then lemony, citrusy fruits as well as part of that melange flavors. It's a really good wine if your friendship group normally drinks Sauvignon Blanc and you want to get them to maybe expand on that a little bit. A good Gruner Veltliner from Austria is a great stepping stone into something more interesting wines. Not to say that there aren't interesting Sauvignon Blancs, of course they are, but if you just want to broaden your horizons, if you're a consumer, I think Gruner is really interesting for that. Austrian Riesling is a bit of a safe bet because almost always it's dry and textural. So it's not the minefield that you can step into with Germany where you might buy a Cabernet and you don't know it's going to be a sweet wine or an off-dry wine. Austrian Riesling, for the most part, unless it's a dessert wine, obviously, is dry. And they're quite different to the German stuff as well. They're more sort of, what would you say, dense. It's hard to describe, but they're less light on their feet than some of their German counterparts. Very powerful often, but with great balance at the same time. So they're pretty cool.
For what it's worth, I always think that they're a bit more like Alsace, but maybe the rockier side of Alsace.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Freddie was talking last week about Schlossberg, and that sort of is a good analogy. Yeah.
And Gruner, one of the things I love about that, you mentioned the gin and tonic when you're out camping, but I always see that sort of citric element and a little bit of the sort of tonic, those wines as well, that make them a really nice, like, good food wine, but a really nice, refreshing first tipple of the night.
Absolutely. A real first wine of the night scenario. Perfect. Yep.
You mentioned Blaufränkisch. I want to talk a little bit more about that. Moritz, I remember a quote by Alder Yarrow, an American wine writer who I met last year, but a long time ago when I was reading an article about Roland Wellich, the first line of his article was, "I am hardcore." And it was Roland who'd said it. We're talking about the drama of the Wachau, but Blaufränkisch down there in Burgenland can be pretty dramatic as well. It's a great variety that I feel lots more people would love if they knew it.
Yeah, we visited Roland in the vineyards the October before last because he'd just been named Austrian Winemaker of the Year. He was in high spirits. Often when you go and see Roland, you'll get there and before you get to taste any of his wines, there'll be a grower champagne that he wants you to try that he's heard good things about. There'll be his favorite little white Burgundy. There'll be a German Riesling he wants you to try. And eventually you get to his stuff. But the point of that is, and like Philip Whitmer's like that in Germany, a lot of them are, they drink and taste broadly. They know where they sit in the landscape of wine. They know what they're trying to do and they know what they can contribute. So they're not trying to copy anyone. They just know what their place is. So Blaufränkisch, as you say, it's an interesting one. It's a bit like Riesling insofar as it really shows vintage. It can be quite dark and brooding. It can be quite cerebral, delicate, light on its feet as well, and it can be in between. You would have seen me in the past draw this Blaufränkisch triangle. I stole that off Roland. He showed it to me originally. And this is where at one point of the triangle you've got Syrah, another point you've got Nebbiolo, and another point you've got Pinot Noir. And it sort of floats in an imaginary space in between those three varieties. Now, you could probably add Gamay, Cabernet Franc into that as well and make it more of a five-star thing. But sticking to the main theme, that's how I try and describe it to people who maybe haven't had it before. It's not a blend of those varieties. It's nothing to do with those varieties, but just stylistically. And often you'll have someone say, well, I like Pinot. And someone will say, well, I like, Nebbiolo. It's a savory thing. Its tannin is pronounced way this side of the Nebbiolo tannin framework. In the cooler years, it sometimes look like peppery, coat roti, sort of Crozes Hermitage Syrah. When it gets riper and it goes sort of licoricey direction, it can look like Nebbiolo, and often it's in between those, more like Pinot. The fact that they've got like 100, 120, 130-year-old vines to work with really low-yielding limestone soils, it's got a lot of opportunity going forward. And he was able to rescue from what might have been abandoned these old vineyards where, when he started his project in the early 2000s, there's a real push in Burgenland to make international wines. People were fucking around with Merlot and Cabernet and doing stuff. And you're thinking, why are you doing this? He was saying, we've got these great indigenous varieties. Let's celebrate these, St. Laurent and Zweigelt, but mostly Blaufränkisch. Yeah, it remains a really compelling story. And I think it's still only one that's only just getting started.
As you say, the indigenous grapes are pretty exciting, and looking at that triangle, even in theory, you've got that potentially quite ethereal quality of the Pinot Noir and the fragrance, the savouries that you mentioned from the Syrah, the acid and potentially a bit of perfume, but the acid and the tannin structure of Nebbiolo. It's a very compelling picture.
Yep, absolutely. And age-worthy as well. And, the CellarHand team got together just before Christmas, I think it was, for a Christmas party and a staff meeting, and we did a blind tasting in the afternoon. And I pulled out my usual trick of pulling out one of Mauritius wines, and it was a 2007 Lutzmannsberg, and literally everyone at the table thought it was either Burgundy or Barolo, and no one was thinking about that.
Very good. You mentioned Hungary. Those white wines, just tell us a little bit more. You said they're exciting. What do they taste like? Why are they exciting?
Well, we just tasted 3 wines with, I can't even think what the chap's name was. He was out here to visit his sister, and he literally messaged us to say, I'm in Melbourne, and Roland sent me 3 bottles of wine to show you guys. Can I come and see you? And we're like, wow, this is hilarious. This is very cool. Well, what I'd say is we were there year before last with Hannes Schuster, and Hannes in Burgenland, and he'd showed us his own ferment wines, and he showed us ferment wines with age. And again, we were like in raptures as to how great it was, but had no clue what variety it was because we didn't think about it being ferment. And it's obvious that as a great variety can be explored more and more as a serious terroir-driven alternative to Chardonnay. It doesn't say it's anything like Chardonnay. I don't know what it tastes like, but it's got complexity and a sort of central nervous system of energy and minerality and great freshness and power, drinkability. And then the other one, Harshevelu, which I could barely say, again, is a bit similar, but a bit sort of darker white fruit spectrum of flavors. Sometimes they're blended too, sometimes they keep them apart. Because in Hungary, for whatever reason, the demand for, as I understand it, the demand for ferment dry wines isn't what it might be. And probably these guys, Roland getting involved, Hannes getting involved, others of the same sort of thinking, they're pushing new boundaries with it. So again, and I think, you and I think, oh, we know a fair bit about wine. We've been exposed to a lot of stuff, but to taste stuff for the first time and be quite thrown is great because it means that we're doing something right in terms of exploring new things and just, not taking the easy option always. It's just another string to the bow. In the same way as what his brother's doing, Heinz with the Vellich label, working with Muscat Ottenel, which is a really exotic, aromatic, dry, textural, interesting thing. Welsh Riesling, which is like not Riesling.
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? There's a real crossover of those cultures in that corner of Hungary and Austria, various other places, those grape varieties that pop up across those borders in styles that we're not so aware of, but by brilliant winemakers with really interesting soils and sites. They're great finds.
Exactly. And like what Fred was saying about he feels more Alsatian than France, these guys feel Pannonian rather than Austrian. They refer back to the culture that goes across, it goes across borders now, but what would have been the Pannonian region originally, they feel more part of that. Roland is forever getting in trouble with the Austrian wine authorities because he makes Gruner that doesn't taste enough like Gruner for their liking or whatever it is. And he's quite irreverent about that. They've got a softness and a gentleness of being, a calmness to them that they're quite different to the guys in the Wachau who are more like upright Austrians, they're different sort of people.
And we move from the borderlands, as you say, a really interesting set of wines and people, to another place that I think is a more recent discovery for you and one that I know very little about, and that is Corsica.
Well, like with most things with this chat, it all started in Burgundy. There's a great restaurant called Maison du Colombier in Beaune, where we were one night with our good friend Virginie Toppenot from Toppenot-Merme in Moray. And she said, "Oh, this is my friend's wine. This is Clos Venturi. We should have this." And we're like, "No, we want to drink Burgundy." And she's like, No, we can drink Burgundy anytime. Let's have this Clos Venturi. And she was quite right. It was compelling. It was this is a wine made from Scacciarello, and I'd never had it before. I didn't know what it was, but I knew a bit like Blaufränkisch. I could see that I liked it, that it was medium bodied, it had great freshness, a great sense of volcanic soils and minerality and medium weightedness, and it was really delicious. She explained that this was Manu Venturi. The family had taken over from Domaine Vico, and they had two labels, etc., etc. A few years went by, and then he made contact and sent the samples out, and it was like, we don't need more agencies. We've already got enough to do. Did the tasting with Michael Jappy and a few of the guys at work. I went, damn it, these are really, really, really compelling, really like, and there was a look, let's not go too crazy. We're going to Europe. How complicated would it be to go across? And it was like, well, we could fly to Nice and get a short plane across. And so we agreed to go and visit, and Manu asked us if we could be there at like 9 in the morning. I was like, that's really hard because you've got to fly in the day before and all that, which we did. And we turned up at 9 in the morning. He greeted us and he agreed to take us to tour the vineyards. I liked him straight away, mind you, because he had a big Jeep Rubicon ute with big wheels to go up these steep vineyards. I thought, this guy's cool. And it was a bit of sussing each other out. I think the more questions we asked, the more engaged he was, realizing that we were going to ask intelligent questions. But it turns out the reason why he wanted to do the vineyard tour in the morning was that there was an regional end of vintage lunch at his winery starting at 1 o'clock that day, which we got back in time for. And this was like all the great producers of Corsica were there, and they're all bringing other wines. And there was champagnes and Burgundies, Claudio Cigliudi's Barbaresco was on the table. And it's like, wow, these guys are really, again, into what they're doing, but they're into the world of wine. The other thing I'd say in Corsica is awful place to drive, big, big gutters, wrong side of the road, quite sleepy. Patrick may have dented a couple of alloy wheels on a hire car. But yeah, it was like one of those things where I don't know what Don Lucio tastes like. I don't know I don't even know how to pronounce half these things. And we said, well, that shouldn't stop us always. I said to the guys, if we ever get to the stage where, regardless of what sort of other wineries we have on board, that we aren't compelled to do compelling things, then we should give it away, right? And, we're not going to do that. So we're still learning, Ed, about them. We've only been there once. It's exciting across red wine and white wine. They're working biodynamically. They're sensibly priced. But for me, the most exciting grape variety is I'm probably not even pronouncing it right to this day, Scacciarello, which really resonates with me as this discovery of last year, this medium-bodied, spicy, earthy, delicious, have it slightly chilled, replace Pinot with it, replace Nebbiolo with it, replace Blaufränkisch with it, put it in a lineup. Really cool.
Yeah, well, after doing it for some time, it's great to see you still find excitement in bringing back wines, be it from elsewhere in Australia or some far-flung place, and adding them to a portfolio that's rich and varied.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's exactly the point. We've got brilliant wines that Ben Glaetzer makes in South Australia that sell for $25 in one part of our world. And to make a commercial case for Domaine Vico and Clos Venturi, you can't, because it's never going to be big. But what it is, and what I've always wanted to be, is a portfolio where there's always evolution, there's always interest, and we can hit as many points on a restaurant wine list, regardless of what sort of restaurant you have, as possible.
You mentioned your different interests and how important they were for you from your upbringing, those things that you picked up. Liverpool Football Club, pretty important in your life. Who's your favourite player of all time?
Fernando Torres.
Oh, I was hoping you might say that.
Left field, but obviously we've had great Steven Gerrard, Robbie Fowler, Kenny Dalglish, etc., Luis Suarez. The first couple of years that Torres was up front as number 9, he was just the most devastatingly exciting, explosive dude who could literally turn a game on its head in 2 seconds. And it was because he'd come into the side at a time when they weren't that exciting. And there was a couple of years there where he formed this partnership with Steven Gerrard, where Stevie G was playing a little bit further forward than he used to. And they were just incredible. We're actually going to the last game of the season, the home game against Crystal Palace. Hopefully, we'll be celebrating a title win. But yeah, it's pivotal to my entire existence.
And Fernando Torres, a cherubic-faced, twinkle-toed striker from Spain. If you had a chance to sit down for a drink with Fernando Torres, you're choosing the wine. This is a dude that can afford anything, so we're not going to impress him on price. What are you going to surprise him with?
Well, the first thing I'd have to agree to is in such a scenario, Virginia would want to be there because she idolized the guy. So that would be the first thing that I'd have to agree to. Look, in a hypothetical world, if I somehow manage to get my hands on a bottle of Domaine Dauphiné Meursault from La Lubise or Oxy Duress, that would be just, fantastic, because these are wines that have got profound greatness, but the supreme drinkability. So I've been lucky enough to have a few of those over the years. But I mean, really, you could go in so many directions. If all bets are off and I'm not paying for the bottle and, he doesn't care how much it costs anyway, that might be a thing.
All right, you are paying for the bottle. What are you buying?
Let's come on. It's Torres. It's Torres. I'd pay for it. Okay, I'd still pay for it.
You would. And then moving across, I'm thinking someone like Neil Razor Ruddock, as you'd guess by the name, Liverpool's brutal enforcer from the mid-90s. I'm imagining that he probably likes a fairly robust red wine. What would you serve him from Australia?
I'd serve him Ben Gleitz's Amon Ra, because I love that wine. And sometimes it gets overlooked in our portfolio because there's things that are more in vogue and more topical. But, whenever we have a bottle or share a glass of that or show it to sommeliers, well, you've got this lovely, bursting with flavour Barossa Valley Shiraz from Old Vines that's really quite precise and pure at the same time. Ben does this thing where he ferments the wine really cold and he captures all this freshness. Yeah, that would be something that Razor Ruddock, even with his mentality, could probably get his head around.
Those gnarled, old, low-yielding vines in the Barossa probably are a bit Razor Ruddock-ish.
They probably
in
are.
their
Yeah.
appearance. Yeah. Last couple of questions. One, a favourite everyday wine from your portfolio. Would be treated as a quaffer, but that really over-delivers.
Stefano Lubiana Primavera Pinot. That family are just on fire. And Steve in particular, is mad about four-wheel driving and gear and all that. He was in Melbourne recently. He texted me to say, what's the name of that restaurant we went to the other night when I was here for work? And I'm like, are you back? And he's like, yeah, I'm going to the camping show tomorrow. I'm like, oh, okay. It was a restaurant called Ascal in the city. Fantastic. But yeah, that wine used to be from partially estate grown fruit and partially purchased. It's now all estate grown. It's now biodynamic. And it captures a really good snapshot example of what Tasmanian Pinot can be. Lots of flavour, but not too heavy, not too brooding, great freshness. Drink it slightly chilled, as I always do with Pinot, sort of 14, 16 degrees. Drink it with anything or just drink it by itself. That would spring to mind.
And last question. It's Friday night. What are you going to drink?
When I get home on a Friday night, usually there'll be a beer, and it's something as mundane as an Asahi or something like that. But beyond that, when we start to put some stuff on the barbecue, gin's growing, all sorts of stuff up here at the farm, all sorts of spices and chili and all that sort of thing. So it sometimes depends on what we're having for dinner. But look, almost always there'll be a bottle of Riesling in the equation. It'll often be 4 or 5 years old, and it might be one of ours, or it might be Crawford River, or it might be something else, might be something that the Barry boys have made. The other night I had one of the early Walter Walters. I can't remember, I think it was 2017, and it was just delicious. And again, wines that you consume and you don't have to think about too much, you just like for pure drinkability, drinking pleasure. Beyond that, we usually progress to a Chardonnay wine, and then there'll be a Pinot Noir of some kind, depending on who's drinking, how many people are there. But not extravagant drinking at home, and not like, we're drinking these crazy wines. I see some people on the internet drinking just incredible stuff all the time. We're not those guys. We love good food and love good wine, but in a sensible, respectful way. I mean, I think some stuff I see on the internet is quite vulgar. Here I am talking about Dovernay, mind you, but I haven't had one of those in quite a while.
And I suppose something like Water closes the circle quite nicely, because that's families, that's portfolio, and that's a Clare Valley, South Australia collaboration with your good friend Ernst Lawson up in the Mosel.
Exactly, and that was the one thing where Peter Barry emailed me years and years ago, around about 2010 or something, and said, my son, Tom, would like to go to Germany to do vintage. Could you set him up with someone? And I set him up with Ernie Lawson, and it all sort of went from there. And it's like this thing that we all feel intertwined in. It's really lovely. So yeah, really good, really cool.
And that's it for this week's podcast. If you like what you heard, please like it, subscribe, pass it on. All that means so much. You can also subscribe to my Substack. That's edmerison.substack.com. Comments are massively welcome. Let me know what you'd like to hear more of. In the meantime, huge thanks to my friends Lucas James for the music and Neil Williams for the artwork, Elizabeth Clancy for the edit, and to my guest, Patrick Walsh. Till next time, live wine to the fullest. Cheers.